We have the Sim Portland 2022 Chief Information Officer of the Year, John Kochavar, with us today. And what we are going to be talking about is business storytelling for technology executives. Now, John, I think when we say storytelling and IT, those two things don't usually go together. But I think in our pre-show conversation, you were telling me about how important it is to learn storytelling. So I'd like to hear just a little bit about your journey and how you came upon this truly necessary skill.
Yeah, well, Doug, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to, just share a few of my thoughts around storytelling for technology leaders. First of all, I'll say that my background is really as in social science. Right, my
Uh-huh.
undergraduate degree was in sociology, and so I don't have any technical training, which may turn off your audience immediately. But um,
It's actually kind of interesting you say that because, and it's, I mean, because this seems to be true in a lot of fields, but particularly in information technology, is that, in order to rise up the individual contributor ranks, you have to be very technically proficient. But once you get into leadership, there's a completely different skill set that needs to engage. And so you end up having this really weird dichotomy, which is where a lot of the people who are best suited to lead other people will by definition not be the best technicians and vice versa.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that because, when I finished school, I finished with a sociology degree, as I mentioned. And, I graduated in sort of the mid to late 90s, and it was really hot in Silicon Valley. You had Mark Andreessen that had founded Netscape. And I remember lamenting sort of the fact that I had a social science degree and not a technical degree, because I felt like I was kind of,
Okay. Go, well, yeah, why didn't you go to
I
college,
couldn't
get a real
join.
degree?
Yeah, and I couldn't join the crowd, right? But I did actually start my career in a startup, and I think that's probably where I started learning this idea of storytelling, because I was the eighth employee that was hired into what was then called the Home Education Network, that turned into onlinelearning.net.
Mhm.
And when you're in the early stage of company, you better have a good story if you're trying to attract venture money. And at the time I was learning from my mentor, who was the president and CEO at the
Mhm.
time. And I think that's really where I got into this idea of the importance of telling a compelling narrative. And you live, real life challenges, because if you don't deliver value, you can't make payroll, right? And so that you hear of stories like, well, you proverbially eat what you kill. And
Uh-huh.
I've carried that over from the startup days, even to my corporate time at General Electric, or now here at Portland General Electric. And so those are really formative, I think, experiences I had earlier in my career.
Yeah, well, and I would say the storytelling, I think, especially gets punctuated in the startups because I don't know what kind of startup you were at, but a lot of the startups in the 90s didn't have, much less not having profits, a lot of them didn't even have revenue. And so their ability to make payroll basically depended on their ability to continually raise money.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Now, the good news is we did have revenue, and
Okay.
it was a relatively small startup. So we cleared $1 million one year, and I was like, oh, this is really awesome. But then at some point you have to scale, right? And so how do
Yes.
you tell that narrative and story for your team and for your investors of how you're going to scale? So I think there's this mix of strategy and narrative in order for you to be really credible.
It's funny because we're saying strategy, and of course, when I got my MBA, was probably the single most overused buzzword. Happened the entire time because at least one of the things that I observed is that you have some companies that will put together this really, really elaborate quote strategy with no detail at all behind how it's actually going to happen, and you have other places where you'll have tremendous detail, which is basically a really, really anal retentive operating plan. It doesn't necessarily involve any real change in direction. I don't know if you've observed the same phenomenon.
Yeah, I have. And one of the things that I picked up from my startup days, as I sort of, I'll call it, graduated or moved toward,
Yeah.
multinationals and big corporations, is, having a broader vision for what it is that you want your team to be, I think, is one of the most important things that you can do.
Yeah.
And let me pull that thread a little bit, because
Yeah.
I think the best talent want to work on the most ambitious projects, right? Now, if E school term would be a BHAG, right? The
Yeah.
big, hairy, audacious goal. I think the best of us want to work on those things, right? And at Portland General Electric, where I'm at today, we're trying to do an 80% decarbonization by 2030 and 100% zero emissions from our business by 2040. We were the first, and I think we're still the only U.S. utility to sign the climate pledge, which says that we're going to be zero emission by 2040. And I think that's a BHAG, right?
Now, just out of curiosity, are you allowed to cheat and buy offsets?
No, no.
Okay, and does this have to be like real zero emissions?
This is ZE, zero emissions, right? Not buying offsets. This is legit. And I think having ambitions that are that big are how we can attract and retain the best talent. Now, behind that, you've got to be able to articulate, well, how do you think you're going to get there? Now, part of the challenge today, at least in our business, is you've got to balance this idea of reliability, affordability, and clean, right? And so those of your audience members that are in the energy space will know this to be the trilemma, right? I can give you two, but not all three. And so that's one of the challenges that we get to really tackle. And what I tell my team is, I said, one of the things we get to do is solve some of the world's toughest energy problems. And you need the best and the brightest to do that. And so going back to that narrative I talked about, setting those BHAGs, outlining that strategy, and it's got to be credible, is what's going to help us get the right talent to solve some of these tough problems.
Yeah, well, I'd love to unpack that a little bit, because I should let you know that I spent a lot of my career over at Intel Corp, and Intel absolutely loved the phrase BHAG, but the way that it usually worked at Intel would be there'd be some really, really big goal that was articulated, and then all of us were evaluated based on how the whole company did that goal. But my particular department had no direct connection to that goal at all. So I was basically evaluated on how other people performed, irregardless of whether I meaningfully contributed to that or not.
Yeah. So here's what I would say to that, Doug, and I'm going to put Intel aside, right? I'll give you my sort of opinion on this. I think a big part of this is how a company and how leaders specifically set goals that include measurable outcomes.
Yeah.
That is invaluable. It is imperative.
And it would be even better if those measurable outcomes were actually under your control.
Well, yes, but I think that is the part of the job of the leader of any organization and leaders of the organization is, if you can't articulate how the work that you're doing ties up into the broader goal of the company, I think it warrants questioning whether that should continue to operate, right? And so let me sort of add, in our pre-discussion, I talked about one of my favorite quotes, which is, the person who knows how will always have a job, but the person who knows why will always be their boss, right? And so as we think about the why we're doing things, I would invite all of your listeners to ask the question, why am I doing this thing? And how does it roll up to the goals of the organization? And if we can't answer that question, then I think we ought to question whether we should be doing that thing, right? And I think the best of us will do exactly that.
I think I'd like to append on that also, in that the why you're doing this, if the only thing you can come up with is because you're getting paid, it's probably not going to ultimately be that fulfilling, because the people who made campaigns to try to sell cigarettes to kids got paid. But one could argue, well, actually one can't argue, it's actually rather clear, it was a very socially destructive type of thing. Getting paid very well to do something that's decreasing the value of your community at large is probably not the best long-term career plan. You do okay financially, but there's that whole having an empty soul thing that you have to contend with.
Yeah, and I think what I have found, particularly, as we got into the pandemic, and now as we get into this new normal, I think a lot of people have asked themselves that exact question: is, hey, is what I'm doing really fulfilling? And I think that becomes a really terrific opportunity for companies like PGE, right, to be able to attract and retain some of this great talent that's saying, hey, look, I want to do something more meaningful, something that allows me to leave a positive fingerprint on this planet, right? And so having those right BHAGs, having that narrative is part of creating that culture of belonging, I think, that so many people are looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, I'd actually like to pivot back a little bit to one of the things you'd mentioned, because you were talking about a different variant of the classic iron triangle, right? Project management, right? They say there's 3 points of the triangle. You have cost, speed, and quality, and you can pick two. and you never get all three. But what you're saying is that in order to fulfill the climate pledge, essentially that PG has to figure out how to do all three. So I would love to hear your magic formula.
Yeah, so I want to modify the triangle just a little bit, right? So there's the speed, cost, and scope, right? But in my opinion, I think quality is expected. That is hygiene, right? And so in terms of the challenges that we look at in the trilemma and the triangle that I described with affordability, reliability, and clean, I think that's where we are kicking over stones in the market for the best technology that provides the most value for our customers. But it means that you got to go out there and look for it. And it means you got to create new structures. You've got to integrate technologies in new and different ways, in order to make this happen. And that is really some of the hard work that's out there because, could we go all green today and do it reliably? Yeah, but it costs a fortune.
Yeah, I was going to say of the three, the affordability is going to be that tricky one. I mean, because particularly if you're trying to make power affordable based on median income, because I think for Oregon, I mean, Portland area is going to be a little higher, but still Portland area median income for per capita or I think household is going to be around 55, 60,000. That's not a ton of money.
Yeah, relatively speaking, exactly. And I think one of the challenges, Doug, as you pointed out, is that
half of the people are below that too. That's the middle. Half are below that.
Right. Right. I think part of the challenge for us is that unlike many other companies, we can't discriminate, right? So if you are, a big multinational out there selling a product or a service, you can discriminate based on price, right? You go, well, hey, you don't buy my service, that's fine. But we have an obligation to serve everybody. Right. And so we have to try and do that affordably. And we're in an environment where this is not just Oregon. This really applies to other parts of the country where, 20 to 25% of our customers have a hard time affording electricity. So they're going to get, incentives from, different support groups and whatnot. And so that's the balance that we have to strike. But I think that's where you need the best and the brightest, right, to be able to make that happen.
Yeah, at the time of this recording, we're at the end of November in 2022. The Bureau of Economic Analysis numbers are probably going to come out, but thus far we've had 2 quarters of recession. There's a halfway decent chance we're going to be looking at a 3rd quarter. And so the number of people who have difficulty affording their power is more likely to go up than down in the near future.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then we balance that with legislation, right, that has come out as part of House Bill 2021, which says that, hey, electric companies within the state of Oregon, we need you to be at 80% decarbonization on a 2010 baseline by 2030 and then 0 emissions by 2040. So, I think that's what gets me excited in the morning is like, that's the challenge. We're going to find a way to get there, right? And we need our customers to help us get there as well. And there's a bunch of neat programs that you can find on our website, but it has to do with flexible load, those smart thermostats that you've installed from Google and Honeywell and Ecobee, those and all of the electrification that we're doing with transportation electrification, electric vehicles, all of that can help contribute to us meeting those ambitious goals.
Well, trying to do my part also. I actually just got a notice from the solar company that installed the panels on my house with link to an instruction PDF so that when I go home tomorrow, I'm going to be flipping the breakers, turning on my system and helping decarbonize the system. But let's just play it straight. I'm trying to save money.
Hey, yeah, and everybody is, and we totally understand that, right? So I think that's totally fine.
Outstanding. Well, hey, I think we're actually going to have a second part of this interview coming up pretty soon. But John, just one last thought to kick us off for right now.
Yeah. So, the thing that I'd say as we get ready for the second part is, just a couple of leadership lessons maybe that I picked up, and we'll talk about it in the second part here, is the importance of measurable outcomes. We'll kind of touch on that. This is all going to tie back into a narrative. And then we'll also maybe touch on this idea of accountability and ownership, right? And so this is less about being a victim of circumstance, but being the master of our domains. And I don't mean that in the Seinfeld cut.
I was fighting that tendency because I literally had the Seinfeld episode playing in my mind.
Yeah, but ownership and accountability, that'll be another thing that we kind of touch on in the second part here.
All right, excellent. So everybody, make sure to listen to part 2 so we can be talking about ownership, accountability, and I'm going to throw it in there, being master of your domain, but not in the way you think. All right. Thank you so much, John. We'll talk to you in a few.
All right, very good.